Hey, Leroy, turn it on. Okay, Uncle Shady.
You're listening to BWWR, the Banger Worldwide Radio Network.
The John LeBang Show has been known to make people laugh, sing, think, scream, throw things in rage, and generally lose their minds. Listener discretion is advised.
Scheduled programming to bring you a show on the edge, broadcasting worldwide and out to the greater universe. You're listening to the John LeBang Show.
Greetings, Earthlings, and alert the media. Tonight, we have a special broadcast for you. My good friend Derek Shelmerdine is joining me, and we're going to talk about the best 100 albums. Derek, how are you, sir?
I'm very well, John. It's great to be back with you again. This is going to be an interesting time, a look at the 100 best albums of all time, sort of created on a combination of Billboard performance album sales and a vaguer area called recognition among music fans. So it should be an interesting time looking at what's in there and what maybe could have been in there, and who's dominating the top 10, certainly best albums of all time.
Well, that's where it'll get down to the nitty-gritty, is the top 10, who... and that'll be debatable between all the fans out there, everybody listening. And then if you're listening out there, ladies and gentlemen, you want to join the conversation, go to the chat room and give us your opinion on what you think is the best 100 albums. Maybe you disagree with some of the picks. Maybe you want to throw in something that Billboard and all that didn't think of, or Derek or myself didn't think of, because there are so many great albums, Derek. It's hard to list just 100.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the more I've been sort of looking at this and thinking about it, every time I have a new look, another album pops into mind, and I thought, well, that would have been a good one to include. But what is interesting is that Sgt. Pepper didn't actually made the top 10, it made the top 5. But the top album in this list is actually Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with that.
Yeah, and it's now clocked at 937 weeks on the Billboard 100. It actually did go in the record books originally for clocking up 736 consecutive weeks when it was first released. So it's no real surprise that it's sold a bunch of 15 million or so albums. But I mean, it is a great album, and it was a groundbreaking album, I think, in the at the time in the early 70s. And
it was really well produced for the times as well.
Oh, absolutely. It was the beginning of that whole soundscape arena type era, and it's just such a great album.
And that time period, Derek, that's when a lot of the artists were expanding their horizons in writing music, and they would experiment more. And we could look at Dark Side of the Moon as somewhat of an experimental album when you'd seen what they had done earlier. It was a lot different than that first album that Pink Floyd did that didn't even make the top 100.
That's right. It took them into a whole new area. I think it was the first one that was the lyrics were completely written by Waters as well, Roger Waters. But as you can imagine, I mean, the Beatles have also come out extremely well in this particular poll. They took number 2 with Abbey Road, then number 4 with Pepper, 5 with the White Album, 6 with Revolver. So, in the top 10, they've got 4 of the positions, which is absolutely unbelievable for a band that split up in 1970.
Yeah, but they were, for their short history, they produced probably more good songs than any other artist in that time. Well, they were together, 8 years, maybe?
Yeah, it depends how you look at it. It was 1956 57 rather, when they first sort of started as the Quarrymen, but Ringo didn't join them until 1962, just before they released their first single in the UK, and that was "Love Me Do."
Right.
Because the drummer that had been with them for a couple of years before that, Pete Best, when they got to the studio, George Martin, the producer, EMI producer, wasn't impressed and suggested that if they want a record contract, they need to get a new drummer. And the long and the short of it is there are 3 versions of "Love Me Do" recorded. But if you think that was 1962, you could really say that was certainly that's the beginning of the Fab Four, because they had local success around Liverpool before that. 1962 was when they really started to the fore. By the end of 63, they were very, very popular in the UK. But it was the beginning of 1964 when they went on the Ed Sullivan Show in, I think, the February, that they really took America by storm. I think offhand it was something like 73 million people listened to the Ed Sullivan Show that evening.
And to imagine Abbey Road, isn't that their official last album?
It is, yeah. That's because what happened was the Let It Be album, which interestingly enough didn't make the cut. That was a big problem for them. It started as the Get Back project. But that was the time, I mean, after the Beatles' White Album, or during the Beatles' White Album, the band really was falling apart. There's no two ways about that. So when the Get Back album was the one that should have followed the White Album, they just couldn't get their act together, basically. And after about 18 months of toing and froing and cutting the tracks, Phil Spector was brought in, and over a period of about 3 weeks, which is a nanosecond, I think, in Phil Spector time,
right.
He pulled the album together, completely remixed it, and put his own mark on it, and it turned into the Let It Be album, which was the last one that was actually released, although Abbey Road was technically the last one that was actually recorded.
And Abbey Road being at number 2, that was filled with great songs. Everything come together, and Maxwell Silver Hammer.
Oh, it's a great album. It's also got lots of Paul is Dead messages in it as well. I mean, the cover itself is the famous zebra crossing, and if you look at the way they're dressed was very much seen as the Undertaker, the preacher, the grave digger, and the corpse, as it were, crossing the street.
Right, because Paul was barefoot.
That's right, absolutely. And there's just behind the zebra crossing, there's the sort of road crossing. There's a VW car, and it's got the registration 28 if, which would have been his age if he'd been alive.
They were playing that up the whole time.
Yeah. And Pepper as well has got a lot of the Paul is Dead messages on it. If you look at the back sleeve, Paul's standing with his back to the camera, and his head is in line with the lyrics "For Within You, Without You."
And so that made number 4.
Yeah, made number 4. And the White Album made number 5. I mean, it had a lot of problems when they put it together, but it's still a really good album, I think.
Yeah, I actually thought that was ranked a little higher because I liked Revolver better than I liked the White Album, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people reckon that's the Beatles' best album. I mean, it was the second one that had all original songs. It was the one before that, Rubber Soul, that had all original Lennon McCartney songs. Well, that's technically in the UK, because up until Sgt. Pepper, the album tracks were different on each side of the Atlantic, and even by the time he got to Rubber Soul and Revolver, where the album titles are the same, the track listings are slightly different on both of those as well. So it's amazing now to think that it wasn't until Sgt. Pepper, which is 67, that the alignment finally happened, and the albums being released on both sides of the pond were identical.
Yeah, but look at the timeline. You got Meet the Beatles, which was in 64. You got Rubber Soul 65, 66 Revolver, 67 Pepper, 68 The White Album, 60. I mean, these guys were at the pinnacle of writing. Boom, boom, boom. Everything was good that they put out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's good to include that first album as well. And as you say, you can just see that every year that, because that was when they hit the jackpot in '64 after the Ed Sullivan Show, and then you can see of the albums there, one of their albums from each year, well, their album from each year made it. I mean, that Meet the Beatles got to 75. I thought what was also interesting about the list, at 78 is George Harrison's All Things Must Pass. And he was the only Beatle to make it into the listing with a solo album. So no John Lennon albums made the list, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, because it was Lennon and McCartney who did the majority of writing with the Beatles, and Harrison was like, you get a song or two an album maybe out of Harrison, and he puts this collection of songs that makes 78.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people think that he made a bit of a mistake because a lot of these songs, I suppose most of these songs he'd written at the time when he was with the Beatles, but as you say, very few of his made it actually onto the albums, and even fewer onto the singles. But he stored them all up and he banged them all out into his first album. So I think it's one of the reasons why that's such a really good album.
Yeah, and I think the Beatles in themselves would, there was a style to each writer, and when they went solo or away from the Beatles, they carried on some of that flavor with them. You could tell what songs were McCartney's now that you saw him with the Wings, and you could tell what songs were Lennon's because you heard him solo, and you were like, okay, now we can, because they always gave each other credit. Both writers got the credit for it. For every song. Right. I think that was a deal they made, correct?
That's right. I mean, even John Lennon's first single, Give Peace a Chance, is credited to Lennon and McCartney.
Which is interesting, right? Because he probably had something to do with it. And, if that's really honorable, even though they couldn't stay together, it was really honorable of a deal they made saying, hey, we'll both get credit for all the songs we write together, whether I write it or you write it or whatever. We just do it that way.
That's right. Yeah, some of the early ones are credited to McCartney, Lennon as well, Around the Other Way.
Which albums?
Some of the early singles are credited to McCartney, Lennon rather than Lennon, McCartney.
Oh, okay, interesting.
So they sort of swapped it around a little bit. But most of it goes out as Lennon, McCartney.
Well, that's alphabetical. I would think that's the way that just happened that way eventually.
Yeah, makes sense, really.
So Ringo Starr's on tour, by the way. So we can still see some of the Beatles out there.
That's right. I mean, he's been on tour for a while, and he's really getting around. You can see him between the 23rd of June and the 29th of September. If you happen to be in Israel, Spain, Luxembourg, Monaco, Italy, and of course America, where he rounds off his current tour.
Yeah, he hasn't taken a break.
This is an extension. I mean, he's been on the road quite a while before this. These particular dates now, because I remember we spoke about the Beatles some months ago. He was on the road then, so he's a busy chap. He's a popular chap too, I think.
Yeah, and I guess when you do something your whole life and you like doing it, why not keep playing?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's quite amazing, really, looking at who's on tour. And if they're still around, the majority of, a vast number of bands from the 60s, the 70s, as we'll see as we go through, I mean, they are on the road at the moment, or they've just come off from tours, which is great news.
We've got to take a quick pause for the cause. We'll be right back right after this to talk more of the best 100 albums of all time. Stay tuned.
Don't go anywhere now.
John will be right back right after this.
Yes, it will.
Check out the new book from Derek Shelmerdine,
Rock and Roll Unraveled.
It tells the story of rock and roll from its roots right up until the mid-70s punk.
Rock and Roll Unraveled.
Not just the music, but also the events that shaped the music.
Rock and Roll Unraveled.
It includes the backgrounds to recording sessions, singles, album releases, births, and deaths,
epic concerts and festivals.
Rock and Roll Unraveled.
Shelmerdine has made a painstaking effort to document pretty much every event that would prove significant in shaping popular music.
Rock and Roll Unraveled.
Purchase the book at www.rockandrollunraveled.com. Follow him at Twitter at R&R Unraveled and look him up on Facebook at Rock and Roll Unraveled.
Rock and Roll Unraveled.
By author Derek Shelmerdine.
Available now.
Hey, man, you're listening to the John LeBang Show, man. The place where chronic brain cell rejuvenation happens.
Feel like you're getting any smarter yet?
We continue our discussion of the best 100 albums with my guest, rock and roll historian and author of the book Rock and Roll Unraveled, Mr. Derek Shelmerdine. Now we move on to another band that has a lot of albums on the charts here, on the top 100, and that's Led Zeppelin.
Which their best one is the number 4 album. Yeah, that got to number 3. I mean, they've got 5 in the top 20. I mean, most of their albums are there, which I was actually slightly surprised about when you look at some of the other bands. You'd expect, or you'd be disappointed if the majority of the Beatles albums weren't there after Rubber Soul. But Led Zeppelin, they've made some awesome albums. I mean, they're in at number 3 with Zeppelin 4, number 10 with Zeppelin 2, number 11 with their debut album, which I actually think is one of the best debut albums of all time. I can remember buying that when it came out.
I loved it too.
Absolutely. Oh, it's an awesome album. And at 16 with Physical Graffiti.
And 19 at Houses of the Holy.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And it doesn't stop because they're at 59 with In Through the Outdoor and 68 with Led Zeppelin 3. Next to the Beatles and Pink Floyd, they're really dominating the top 100.
Very much so. Very much so.
Now, Volume 4, or 4, as they call it, that one definitely deserves to be there. But, after their first album, Zeppelin, I didn't really care for the entire album like everybody else did. I mean, all my friends growing up, they were like, Zeppelin, 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 and I liked them, but I wouldn't have put Zeppelin 2 in the top 10. Put it to you that way.
No, I'm with you on this. I thought their first album was absolutely awesome, so I bought the second as soon as it came out and was a little bit disappointed. And I never did get around to buying 3. But I think since Zeppelin 4 has gone up in my estimation enormously. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's the only album to have a guest singer, Sandy Denny, who sings Battle of Evermore. She was one of the real UK folk rock heroes of the early mid 70s. And my all-time favourite Zeppelin track, When the Levee Breaks, an old blues standard, which I think it's got some awesome drumming. John Bonham, I think, really gives that some serious drive. And, of course, it's got Stairway to Heaven on it.
Rock and Roll. Black Dog. Going to California. See, that's what makes a great album to me. When you look at it, it's from front to back. It doesn't matter how many songs it has.
Yeah, I mean, Rock and Roll is a fabulous track, and it's one of the few that's actually credited. I'm pretty sure the writing credit goes to all of them on that one.
It's probably next to Stairway to Heaven, their maybe second most popular song of all time, and maybe most played song. Been a long time since you can't even. That's just great.
Oh, it just captures the essence of rock and roll, really. The Led Zeppelin 2, there's a sort of, ironically, probably the most famous track on that, one of their most famous tracks ever, A Whole Lot of Love, comes from Zeppelin 2. Now, in the UK, Led Zeppelin decided that it was very uncool to release singles. Their first one sort of more escaped than was released and then was pulled after the first few went out, so that's very collectible in the UK. But after that, they didn't release any singles in the UK. But the Whole Lot of Love song, though it wasn't their version of it, was used on Top of the Pops, which is one of the most popular, well, certainly the most long-lived British pop show. And it was a singles-based show. There were no albums on it. It was just what was rising in the charts. I mean, for many years, the production of the show was based around the fact that they only had singles on the show, and they only had singles that were rising, unless it was somebody that stayed at number one. And the theme tune for that was a big band version of A Whole Lot of Love. And I thought that was one of the great ironies of rock and roll, that a band who hated singles, or well, I don't know so much they hated them, because in America they released a whole bunch of singles, but they wouldn't release them in the UK.
But the US was probably a bit more single-based for the music, and UK was a little bit more album-based. Am I wrong in that?
No, you're probably right, and certainly in the UK, towards the latter part of the 60s and the early part of the 70s, the market changed dramatically, because that was when the whole prog rock thing, psych thing, was really starting to pick up steam, and that was all very albums-based. A lot of bands just didn't release singles. Sometimes the record labels would put out a single taken from an album and cut it down from its 7-minute album version to a 3.5-minute single version.
Yeah, Meatloaf had that, didn't they?
Yeah, well, very much. Yeah, it's good to see Meatloaf make the cut as well.
Yep, they did make the cut.
Yeah, at number 30. I mean, that's a great album.
Yeah, I was never a huge Meatloaf fan, but I respect their popularity. 30 would have been a little high for me. Some of the bands or the albums that I had sent you that didn't even make the list would have probably been up that high versus Meatloaf. But, obviously they spent a lot of time figuring out charts and everything to get, have this list that, it's filled with all kinds of great bands and albums. Absolutely. Robert Plant's on tour too before we move on to the next band, right?
Oh yeah, and he's another guy that's really getting around. He's on the road from the 21st of June to the 28th of October, and you can find him in America, Turkey, Georgia, France, Italy, Germany, Chechnya, back into the USA then, before he comes over to the UK and Ireland. So there's lots of opportunity to catch him.
There was so much talk about like a reunion album, and they just can never get it together like some of the other bands. And I think that would sell like crazy, because Black Sabbath just did that Reunion 13 album. That sold very well. I would think Zeppelin, if they could get it together, would just blow the charts away with a new album. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they did have a reunion concert, relatively recently, and that's sold out absolutely immediately. I mean, they're a very, very popular band. I mean, there's no two ways about that. I mean, I was rather sad not to see some Cream in the charts, and I think Zeppelin representing sort of heavy rock, as it were. It'd be nice to have seen Cream in there as well with some heavy rock albums.
Yeah, they were a great band, and now that you bring that up, and you said earlier, as you're going through the list, you keep thinking of other albums, and Cream didn't even come to mind. But now that you bring them up, you're right. They definitely could have been in the top 100.
No, I think they should have been, really. I mean, if you think that rock music itself, as opposed to sort of rock and roll, as it were, I didn't really start until 65, 66, and Cream were one of the very, very first bands that really progressed rock and roll into what became rock music with the power trio and stuff. I mean, I think they're one of the most influential bands. I really do.
Mm-hmm. No doubt about it. So going from that, Pink Floyd has 4 albums in the top 100.
Absolutely. I mean, 2 in the top 10, and then just outside the top 10 at 12 with The Wall. I mean, they were at 9 with Wish You Were Here, which is probably my favourite Pink Floyd album. And another one of my favourites, actually, Animals, is at 86. For some reason, there's a big gap. They were at 1, 9, 12, and then down to 86. I guess The Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, and The Wall, they're certainly they're landmark albums for different reasons.
Yeah, but Dark Side of the Moon being on the charts for so long, it's hard to argue with number one there. I mean, there's no album that even comes close to that.
No, that's right. That's right.
But I would have put The Wall ahead of Wish You Were Here, in my opinion. Animals would have been in the top 50. But, again, these are subjective a little bit. The Wall, though, not only was it an album, but there was a movie with it. There was something incredible that was going on with Pink Floyd at the time.
Yeah, and it's interesting when, because Pink Floyd all sort of fell apart. Roger Waters and the other guys didn't get on, and then musical differences, and they eventually split. But when they did split, Roger Waters kept the rights to The Wall. So you find that he's the one that is out on the road every now and again doing a version of The Wall, because what he was fighting over was the rights to the name Pink Floyd, but the other three guys won that battle. But as part of the deal, he kept the rights to the Wall. I mean, I was lucky enough to see that concert a couple of times at Earl's Court in Liverpool. In fact, for various reasons, I had a backstage pass to one of the nights, access all areas except the little caravan that the band itself was in. But that was an awesome experience, because I got to stand in the orchestra pit just in front of the stage. So when The Wall came down, it was like right there, and it was absolutely awesome concert. I mean, Gilmour for the Comfortably Numb solo, which is awesome track. He came up from behind the wall on a sort of forklift truck, what we call in the UK a cherry picker, that is one of these little cages people stand in on a sort of crane thing that pushes them up in the air, and he rose above it, and it was just an awesome concert. Some concerts stick in your mind. That was one of them.
Derek, another thing that I think gives The Wall a little bit more credibility over Wish You Were Here was the fact that it really wasn't one album. It was two albums put into one. It was so long of an album. And again, from front to back, you're talking 20-plus songs. I don't even know the count, but 20-plus songs of that would keep your attention from front to back.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I don't know if there's another in the top 100 that has that many songs in the collection, that carries the album so well.
Yeah, none of them jump out at me as being a double album. I think you're right. I don't know if there are any other double albums in there.
Is maybe Physical Graffiti? That I think that was extra long as well.
That's true.
Okay.
Yeah, but there certainly are not too many. One of the nice things about Wish You Were Here is that, again, a bit like the Sandy Denny on the Led Zeppelin, they actually have a guest singer in the shape of Roy Harper, who, interestingly enough, was another British folk rock artist, and he sings the lead vocal on Have a Cigar, because apparently he was in there cutting an album, might have been HQ, in the studios at the same time, and Roger Waters wasn't happy with his vocal, and they were all big friends, because Roy Harper used to be one of the acts that would be on the same bill as Pink Floyd and Zeppelin. He had a lot to do with all of them, and he took the lead vocal on Have a Cigar. The only time it wasn't a Pink Floyd vocal.
That has Welcome to the Machines on it, correct?
That's right.
Yeah, what a great song. That's so innovative of a tune.
That was the last time the band saw Syd Barrett as well. He wandered into the studio. I mean, nobody recognized him. He'd put on a lot of weight and all the rest of it. And ironically, they were rehearsing Shine On You Crazy Diamond. It was essentially written about Barrett.
Another great tune. Yeah, Wish You Were Here is just loaded again with songs.
Oh, they're both great. In fact, Wish You Were Here and The Wall sort of alternate in my mind. I can never decide which one's favourite. Sometimes it's The Wall, sometimes it's Wish You Were Here, because they're both fabulous albums.
Yeah, and I think that may be a mood thing, because both albums have mood to them. And Roger Waters is on tour right now.
Oh, and I mean, this guy is all over the place. And this is what I call a tour. I mean, between 24th and December, 24th of June and the 9th of December, he's in Spain, Switzerland, Germany, France, Netherlands, Ireland, UK, Italy, Poland, Denmark, Norway, Latvia, Lithuania, Russia, Brazil, Uruguay, Chile, Peru, Colombia, Costa Rica, and Mexico. Oh, who'd want to be a roadie on that lot?
That's got to be an expensive tour, because I saw him a year ago, and the stage show is so incredible. It leaves you starstruck in awe. Because of how much, I mean, there's a giant like factory that comes right over the crowd. It's just incredible what happens.
Yeah.
But that's the thing with Pink Floyd and Roger Waters. They not only did great albums, but their whole stage show was a thing. It was just a big event that they didn't play cheap with their stage presence.
Yeah, I think they were one of the bands that really pioneered the very spectacular stage shows, because even from the early days they had inflatable pigs and all kinds of stuff. I mean, in the Wall, the stage show there was an aeroplane that actually flew above the audience. It was on a zip wire and came from the behind the audience down onto the stage. Absolutely awesome. Incredible. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've got to take a quick break. That half-hour mark is right here, but don't go away. More of the best 100 albums of all time on the other side of this.
Don't move a muscle. The John LeBang Show is right back.
With lots of fun and excitement. Yes! CRRM, CarePoint Billing Services. Their billers and managers are all dedicated to working for you to increase your profits. For more information, call CRRM at 248-579-3805. CRRM, CarePoint Billing Services.
Hey, man, it's at the bottom of the hour, man. Do you know where your kids are, man?
If you want to contact the John LeBang Show, feel free to send an email to jlebang@live.com. And if you're on Twitter, look him up at John LeBang. And don't forget to go to his Facebook page at The John LeBang Show. Now here's John.
We continue our conversation with Derek Shelmerdine, rock and roll historian and author of the book Rock and Roll Unraveled. Now we've pretty much knocked out the top 10. I think we haven't missed many, but that really was dominated by three groups.
Very much so. Yeah. I mean, the only two people who were also in there was Michael Jackson with Thriller and Fleetwood Mac with Rumours. I mean, two of the biggest selling albums of all time. So you'd expect them to put up a show.
Now, there's an interesting thing there with Michael Jackson, though, is he's like really the pop star of the top 100, because a vast majority were bands or rock artists. He cut his own genre, this pop artist, that when you compare him to all the other bands around him or the albums around him, it's very distinctly different in musical style than the rest of the groups.
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, the whole top 100 is very dominated by hard rock without being too niche, pigeonholing. One type of hard rock or another is very much what dominates the whole thing. But Michael Jackson stands out. I mean, he's at 7 with Thriller and 42 with Off the Wall. He doesn't have sell some albums. I mean, Thriller, 33 million albums and 327 weeks on the charts. Off the Wall, 8 million and 193 weeks on the charts. I mean, he really does move some albums.
Being rock guys, that he may not be our most favorite artist, but you have to respect the man for the accomplishments that of those two albums.
Oh, absolutely. And again, he's one of these guys that really puts on a show. You know, you think about the videos that he does to accompany them. I mean, the guy's a real showman.
Definitely. And we got to give a little credit to Quincy Jones, because he was a songwriter for Michael Jackson. They worked together on a lot of stuff, and I'm sure Quincy Jones had a lot to do with Michael Jackson's Thriller being at number 7.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting how there are people that a lot of people won't have necessarily heard of who were really the power behind the throne. If you think about George Martin, going back to the Beatles, I personally think he had a heck of a lot to do with the Beatles sound and the Beatles experimentation. And he without George Martin, it would have been a very, very different Beatles. So it's interesting how sometimes there are people behind the scenes that are really helping to guide artists in the right direction. They never really get the credit for it.
No, you're right about that, because Mutt Lange, who produced AC/DC, and we'll talk about them a little later, he's the one that really pushed them over the top in making them a superstar band. But we'll get over to them later. We want to talk about the Rolling Stones right now, because they've got
absolutely.
3 in the top 100 as well.
That's right. I mean, their best one was a 31, Sticky Fingers, and then 47 with Some Girls, and then one of my favourite Stones albums, Let It Bleed, at 62. So they're well represented.
They never stopped. Like, some of these bands broke up and all. Rolling Stones have continued to put out music to this day. These guys might be the quintessential band of all time as far as staying together and doing their thing.
Yeah, and by and large, it is the same band. I mean, if you look at bands like the Drifters and the Temptations, they've had, well, the Drifters have had something like 65 people through their ranks and a dozen lead singers. And the Drifters are still on the road. But none of the guys that from the 50s and 60s, I think, are there. But the Stones, essentially, it's the same band. Their lead guitarist has changed once or twice, and a replacement bass player. But it's awesome to think just how successful these guys have been.
And in your notes, you're speaking that the sleeve of Sticky Fingers was designed by Andy Warhol.
That's right. Yeah, the famous zip cover on the album, that was an Andy Warhol creation. And the original ones did actually have a zip, so you could, metal zip, so you could zip it up and down. So if you've got one of those in the attic, that's probably worth a couple of bob now if it's in excellent condition. I'd actually quite like to have seen Beggar's Banquet in there, though, as an album, because that's another one of the albums I think is really powerful Stones. That's the one with things like Sympathy for the Devil, Street Fighting Man, Salt of the Earth on it, and I think that's a great album. That's one of the ones I was rather sad not to see make the cut.
It's interesting. You get 20 people in a room trying to debate who these 100 albums would be, and you would have to come up with a list of 200, and you still wouldn't fit everybody in there.
Oh, no. I mean, it just shows just how many good albums that have been really over the years.
The one thing I've been noticing is that the dates of these albums when they came out, from basically the mid-'60s, and we'll add Michael Jackson in there, till about the mid-'80s, that's where all the great albums, for the majority that we're reading about, that we're talking about right here, that's the majority of where the great albums were in history.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that really dominates the whole thing. I mean, there are none from the 50s, and only a couple from bands that were formed after 1999.
Yep. So you and I got to live through maybe the greatest period of music history, or at least modern popular history.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, if you look at the whole thing, I mean, rock and roll started in the mid-'50s, essentially, the early '50s, arguably the first rock and roll record. But rock and roll as a culture started in the mid-'50s. And what people tend to forget is there were no teenagers before the mid-'50s. Before people like James Dean and the whole teenage angst thing of Rebel Without a Cause. I mean, young men, or when you got out of puberty, you were just a little version of your dad, basically. There was no teenage culture before the mid-'50s. And arguably, a lot of the real teenage culture started in the early '60s, teenage fashions. There were specific, in the UK, you had things like Teddy Boys in the late '50s. But basically, before that, I mean, you were just a little version of your dad. So the whole culture thing kicked off. So not only You've got running alongside the music. Well, a lot of it was driven by the music. I mean, that's one of the really big differences, I think, in certainly the 60s and the 70s, is music was a very, very, very big, it was, the cornerstone of youth culture. I don't think it's as much the cornerstone, well, it definitely isn't the cornerstone anymore.
No, you're right. A song could define a generation back then and be part of history. Even if you were in a band like Nazareth or Triumph or Mott the Hoople, your song could come through, cut through, and that one song. But we're talking about albums. That's a whole different thing when an album cuts through a generation and makes just this mark in history.
Yeah, absolutely.
And before we move on to the next band, Rolling Stones are on tour.
Oh, absolutely. They're just rounding off the tour. They actually played for the first time in a long time in the UK, but sadly those dates are behind us now. But you can still catch them in Europe, in Germany, Czech Republic, and Poland between the 30th of June and the 8th of July. So still a chance to see them. Another band that's been together since 1963, basically. Incredible. And, been performing regularly since 1963. I mean, what a thought.
Yeah, that makes it stand out a little bit more. With all the great bands out there, a band like the Rolling Stones still performing and at a high level. It looks like Mick Jagger still jumps around and moves around like he's 20 years old. How does he do it?
The guy's in his mid-70s. I mean, that is awesome. That is awesome. He's a role model to us all.
That's right. So is Keith Richards. So the next band on the list that has a few albums on the top 100 is The Who. What a great band.
Oh, another one that's a real contender for the best rock and roll band in the world. And I mean, again, they've been around since the mid-60s, early mid-60s, and they've got three. As you'd imagine, Tommy was their best showing at 36, and then Who's Next at 37, and 70 for Quadrophenia. So I think they're, I couldn't argue with those three albums making the cut. I mean, they're all superb albums.
And again, we see 69, 71, 73. This time period in music was so awesome.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
absolutely.
The one thing that with The Who is like Tommy and Quadrophenia, they were more like rock operas on top of albums.
Well, that's right. I mean, they both made movies. Successful movies were both made for both Tommy and Quadrophenia. And what's interesting is Who's Next was also originally planned to be an album called project called Lifehouse, which was Pete Townshend's idea for following up Tommy. He had this really grand idea for another rock opera to follow Tommy, and the basis of that was going to be a post-apocalyptic world where music was going to save the population. It was all very sort of Metropolis, Fritz Lang Metropolis, and Orwell's 1984. It was very much a whole police state, and people were mind controlled by the state, and it was going to be saved by rock and roll. I mean, that in itself is a great idea.
They were a little bit more like Floyd in that regard, where they had stories behind their whole album. It wasn't just a song that told a story. It was the whole album that told a story. And that gives them, a different flavor than some of the other groups. And they didn't always do this, because when they were in the early days, you could see they had like some Beatle influences early on with like My Generation.
Yeah. And interestingly as well, before Tommy, they were very much a singles band. They really weren't thought of as an album group at all until Tommy came along. And it's interesting to have thought what would have happened if the Lifehouse project had actually come to fruition. because I mean they're a phenomenal live band, and part of the idea of this Lifehouse was that it was going to be it was designed to be a movie as well as an album. I think it was United Artists that were backing them, and they pulled away the backing for some reason. And what the Who did is they salvaged some of those songs for Who's Next. So Who's Next is a nice flavour of what the Lifehouse one would have been.
You know, it's interesting when we look at Who's Next, it actually sold a whole million more copies than Tommy, and then Tommy's is still regarded as a better album, although they're 36 and 37, so that's like a flip of a coin, right?
But if you look at the weeks, that's interesting as well, because Tommy was on the charts for 126, and Who's Next was on the charts for 42 weeks. So it obviously sold more intensely. And
Roger Daltrey is on tour.
Oh, that's right. And he's actually performing Tommy at the moment. It's only his show at the moment's only in America. It will probably extend later. But from the 8th of June to the 18th of August, there's a great chance to see him. And he's using sort of local orchestras to work with him as well in the various venues. I mean, that would be an awesome thing to go along to, I think.
Time to take a few moments to pay our bills, but when we return, more of our conversation with Derek Shelmerdine on the best 100 albums of all time. Smoke them if you got them.
Because the John LeBang Show will be right back
After this.
That's guaranteed. Yes.
Pane in the Glass, commercial and residential window cleaning for a beautiful sparkling shine that's crystal clear. Call Pane in the Glass Window Cleaning. You can find them on Facebook at Pane in the Glass. Quality One Painting. For interior and exterior painting needs, call Tom at Quality One, 313-982-2986. Tom will give you free estimates, senior discounts, and I can tell you from meeting the gentleman, he's one of the nicest guys on the face of the planet. So for a quality paint job with a professional attitude, call Tom at Quality One Painting. That's 313-982-2986. 313-982-2986. Quality One Painting.
You're listening to the John LeBang Show.
Join the radio revolution right here.
It's better than some good Thai stick, man. Yes, I would like some too.
So we're going to move on to the last of the top 10 here, and that's Fleetwood Mac. They have 2 on the top 100, but Rumors at number 8, 20 million copies sold. Holy cow.
That's a lot. That's another 263 weeks on the charts. You'd expect to see a Fleetwood Mac album. You'd expect it to be Rumors. I mean, they had 76. They had the album they just called Fleetwood Mac, which is quite rare for one so late. I mean, they were 10 years into it by then. So to have an eponymous title is quite rare. But that was the first Lindsey Buckingham album, Fleetwood Mac itself, in I think it's 75. Personally, I'd prefer the very early Fleetwood Mac stuff when they were still a blues band with Peter Green, because before they got into the 70s and became much more mainstream.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe the reason they went Fleetwood Mac for the 75 album is because Lindsey Buckingham that was her first album. Maybe it was like a little reboot to the band, and maybe they were just like a self-titled album's the way to go. Yeah,
absolutely. Could well be.
108 months is not anything to shake of when you're talking about being on the charts.
That's right. I mean, that is. I mean, all of these albums are unbelievably successful, and by definition, all big sellers. It was interesting, though. I mean, the name of the band comes from the drummer Mick Fleetwood and the bass player John McVie. When the band first got together as Pete Green's Fleetwood Mac, the original bass player was a guy called Bob Brunning. He was there because John McVie was reluctant to leave John Mayall's Blues Breakers because the solid work he was getting with John Mayall's Blues Breakers. But when the band started, they were sufficiently confident that John McVie would join them that they actually did call the band Fleetwood Mac, and he did join them. Obviously, there are a couple of recordings around with the original Bob Brunning, who went on to form his own blues band after that. But I always thought that was a very brave thing to do, to actually use somebody's name that wasn't actually in the band yet as part of the band's name.
They're on tour right now as well.
Oh, that's right. I mean, that is great news. And in the lineup itself, you've got Mick Fleetwood, John McVie, Stevie Nicks, and Christine McVie there, as well as Mike Campbell and Neil Finn. But they're, again, touring America from the 30th of October to the 5th of April next year. So, I mean, they are all over the place. So there's a great opportunity to see Fleetwood Mac in a dance hall near you, as they say.
Next, we have a bunch of groups, artists that are on there a couple times. And this first one surprises me, and it's probably one of the more recent albums that can make the top 100, and that's Santana at number 21, Supernatural.
That's right. I mean, it does have a guest appearance from Eric Clapton on the album. But again, I mean, they're really quite a specialist band in a way. Very Latin rhythms, and a really accomplished guitarist, Carlos Santana. And they've got another one, that's at 21, and at 61 they've got Abraxas, their second album. So it's interesting to see that one of their really early albums managed to make the cut, really, sort of halfway down the chart. That's sold 5 million copies over the years.
And that album in itself, that's one with Black Magic Woman and all those good songs then, right?
Yeah. Oh, it's got some great songs. One of the ones albums of Santana that didn't make the cut that I quite like is Love, Devotion, Surrender, the one with John McLaughlin, who's a great sort of jazz blues, jazz rock guitarist, and he really complements Santana very well, I think.
Santana's on tour as well.
Yeah, Santana's on tour. Sweden, Belgium, Switzerland, Germany, Netherlands, Italy, and France. So across Europe, 20th of June to 4th of July. So again, plenty of chance to catch them.
It's amazing. Everybody keeps going.
Oh, it's incredible. I mean, you look at this 100 albums, and almost all of the people are actually on tour, or sometimes individuals from the bands are on tour. That's great.
Right, Bruce Springsteen, the next guy we're going to talk about, he's on tour, and he's got 2 albums in the 100 as well.
That's right. 34, he's got Born in the USA, and 77, number 77, he's got The River. That's a double album, of course. Both great albums. Another one I'd like to have seen in there, though, is Darkness on the Edge of Time. I love that.
Yeah, Bruce, I respect his musicianship and his band. I mean, he's got a great band. It never just hit it home with me. I was a little harder edged, and I was also, I'm a few years younger than you, so my taste is a little different. Although we like a lot of the same stuff, Bruce wasn't one of my favorites, and Born in the USA would have probably been the only one that would have slid in the top 100 for me. And
yeah, he's a great live artist, though. I saw him when he came over to the UK. I saw him on the 4th of July, funny enough. And I've seen him a couple of times. And he's one of these guys that does really, really long sets. It's the whole evening. I mean, he plays 3-4 hours.
Yeah, but he's got a great band backing him. The E Street Band's just great.
Oh, absolutely. And Clarence Clements, when he was still alive with the band, I mean, awesome sax player. I think what's interesting about Bruce Springsteen, one of the reasons I probably like him a lot, is that back in the rock and roll day, as it were, the lead guitar, electric guitar, wasn't the lead instrument. The break was always a sax break. You listen to 50s rock and roll, and it's very sax driven. And having a sax in a rock and roll band, I think, really adds an edge to it.
Yeah, it's a nice dimension that no one else has kept around. It's been lead guitar player through almost every album we're talking about here. Lead guitar player. I mean, you got Jimmy Page, David Gilmour, just all these great lead guitar players.
Yeah, in fact, I mean, if you were listing, if we were talking about the 100 best guitarists of all time, the people we're just talking about would definitely all make that that cut. You look at Fleetwood Mac, Peter Green, Santana, Townsend is always high up on guitarist stakes. Absolutely.
Yeah, and maybe that'll be a future album. You give me an idea.
Absolutely.
So a future show album. I don't know. See, we're talking albums. I got albums on my mind here.
Well,
Michael Jackson. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, and Springsteen's actually extended his on Broadway because it's sold out, the portion up until now. But it's being advertised as coming on again July 10th to December the 15th. So if you happen to be in that part of the world and you want to see him, it's probably a very, very good idea to get the tickets absolutely as soon as they come out, because it's the second or third time he's done this Springsteen on Broadway, and it seems to sell out very, very quickly.
Yeah, and that's a different way of seeing a artist, is going right there to watch him on Broadway instead of a big concert arena or some festival.
Yeah, exactly.
It'll probably be a tad bit more intimate, if you ask me.
Oh, it'll be great. I mean, that was one thing about when you can see these sort of artists in 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 sort of cinemas, theatres. Absolutely best way to see a band.
Our next two artists, we'll talk about them kind of together. They're both more on the pop side of things, and that's Michael Jackson with the Thriller at number 7. He's got Off the Wall at 42. And then after that, let's touch on Elton John, because he's on there too with 2 albums.
And he got Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, probably his most famous album, at 46. And he was the one that managed to take the 100 slot with Don't Shoot Me, I'm the Piano Player.
Which is a great name for an album.
Oh, it is, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And that sold 3 million copies. So, I mean, that album was no slouch.
Well, that's right. I mean, Goodbye Yellow Brick sold 8 million, but 3 million is, that's a heck of a lot of albums. And
he's on tour as well.
That's right. He's in fact on what he's calling his Farewell Yellow Brick Road tour. And that's, at the moment, it's described as 300 shows across 5 continents.
Gee whiz.
I mean, from the 8th of September, all this final farewell tour starts, because he has got a couple of gigs just before that. But this farewell tour, 8th of September, and it's been projected to finish in 2021.
And he's no young chicken either.
No, absolutely. Oh, he'd been around a long time, because he was in blues bands in the mid-late 60s. And in the UK, there was a singles label called Embassy that Woolworths store used to have as its own label. And what they did copies of current pop hits, but they were people, unknown singers and unknown bands who do those particular songs. And they sold at about half to a third the price of a regular single. And Elton John used to actually perform on some of these copies of current hit singles. So he did a lot of session work as well. I think he's on He Ain't Heavy, He's My Brother, the Hollies song. But he's certainly done a lot of session as well. He was really busy before he found fame as a solo artist.
But you're talking he's going to go on tour at his age for what looks to be 3.5 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, that is unheard of.
Yeah. I mean, the dates at the moment, and there's a lot of them, start at the 8th of September and go to the 11th of September next year, 2019. So he's going to be a very busy guy. Whether it is his last ever tour, who knows? I mean, Frank Sinatra's famously did quite a few farewell tours.
And that's it, ladies and gentlemen, for this 60 minutes of the John LeBang Show. We are going to continue our conversation with Derek Shelmerdine, author of Rock and Roll Unraveled, about the top 100 albums of all time in the second hour. So make sure to stay tuned in. I'd like to thank all of our affiliate stations for carrying the John LeBang Show. Don't forget to go to that website. That's www.jlebang.com, as well as Derek's website, rockandrollunraveled.com. Stay tuned for the second hour on those stations that carry the John LeBang Show back to back. And with that being said, we'll see you in the next hour. This is John LeBang. with our guest, Derek Shelmerdine.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have liftoff. Tune in again next week. Same time,